Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today we're going back in time to Victorian London, but not the London you might typically picture with, like, Queen Victoria and those fancy balls and all that. We're going deeper into like a grittier side of London.
Ooh, cat.
The kind of London that Charles Dickens knew and wrote about in his famous books.
Yeah, Dickens, he was more than just a writer, right? He was like chronicling his times, exposing the social problems of Victorian London.
He was, yeah, and he did it so well, weaving these intricate stories that just captured people's imaginations.
Yeah.
So to help us understand all this, we've got some amazing sources. We've got insights from historian Dan Snow's walking tour of Dickensian London. We'll be looking at passages from Dickens' own works, like Little Dorrit and A Christmas Carol.
It's going to be a really cool blend of history and literature.
Yeah, it'll be like we're right there in Victorian London with Dickens.
Walking the same streets, seeing the places that inspired him.
Yeah, feeling the atmosphere. So let's start our journey with a place that was deeply personal for Dickens, the Marshalsea Prison.
The Marshalsea.
Yeah. When he was just 12, his father was imprisoned there for debt.
Wow, 12 years old. That must have been tough.
It was. It really shaped Dickens' worldview and gave him a deep empathy for those struggling in society.
I can see how that would affect a young kid.
Yeah, for sure. The Marshalsea even became like a recurring theme in his books.
Oh, I bet. Like in Little Dorrit, right?
Exactly. Amy Dorrit, the main character, is actually born and raised within the prison walls.
Wow. So Dickens wasn't afraid to show the hard parts of prison life?
He wasn't. He described it all. The crushing debt, the humiliation of being locked up, the effect it had on families. In Little Dorrit, Amy's father, William, eventually resigns himself to life in prison. He almost finds a strange comfort in being away from his creditors.
It's almost like he sees prison as a kind of twisted safe haven.
Right. It's sad, but it shows how desperate debtors were back then.
Dickens really makes you feel their pain.
He does. And what's so powerful is how he uses his own experiences to shine a light on a much bigger problem.
Yeah, debt imprisonment was a huge issue in Victorian England.
It was trapping so many people in poverty and despair. Dickens gave them a voice.
He forced people to confront the human cost of their economic system.
So powerful. So let's move from the confinement of Marshalsea to another place that feels kind of tracked. Scrooge's counting house.
Okay, Scrooge's counting house.
Yes. In A Christmas Carol, Dickens describes Scrooge going home on Christmas Eve to this dark, empty house. You can feel the suspense building as he gets closer and closer to the appearance of Jacob Marley's ghost.
Oh, spooky.
It is. And historian Dan Snow actually talks about what counting houses were like. Small, cramped rooms rented inside bigger buildings, dimly lit, barely furnished.
Not exactly cozy.
Not at all. And Dickens uses this setting to show how isolated and emotionally detached Scrooge is.
The house is almost like an extension of Scrooge's character.
Exactly. It's like the walls are closing in on him, suffocating him with his greed and loneliness.
Can almost hear the silence in that house.
Dickens describes it so well. He says, "It was with great astonishment and with a strange, inexplicable dread that as he looked, he saw this bell begin to swing. It swung so softly in the outset that it scarcely made a sound. But soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house."
Oh, that's eerie. The bells breaking the silence like that.
And then suddenly the ghost of Jacob Marley bursts in, all wrapped up in chains.
A terrifying reminder of what could happen to Scrooge.
It's a moment that stayed with readers for generations, but it's more than just a scary scene.
It's like a turning point for Scrooge, a wake-up call that his greed will destroy him.
Those chains Marley's wearing, they're like the weight of his sins, a burden Scrooge could inherit.
It's a pretty powerful message about greed and materialism even today.
Yeah, Dickens was holding up a mirror to Victorian society, forcing them to question their values.
That counting house, in a way, represents London's financial district,
Right, a place where money often came before people.
where chasing wealth could lead to a kind of spiritual emptiness.
Exactly. Now, speaking of unsettling things, let's talk about the overcrowded graveyards in Dickensian London.
Oh, right. They were pretty grim, weren't they?
Yeah, Dan Snow describes them as basically overflowing with bodies. It's hard to imagine that right in the middle of the city.
Well, London's population was growing so fast back then, and with poor sanitation and healthcare, people died a lot, especially the poor.
It's a reminder of how fragile life was, especially for those living in poverty.
Even in death, they couldn't escape the awful conditions.
Dickens himself wrote about it in A Christmas Carol. When Scrooge sees the churchyard where he could end up,
Unless he changes his ways, yeah.
he describes it as fat with repleted appetite.
Yikes. That's a creepy image. Like the graveyard itself is a monster.
It is a symbol of the city's failure to care for its people even after they die.
It's not just the physical reality of those graveyards, though.
Right.
Dickens captures the fear of death and decay that permeated Victorian London.
A city ravaged by disease and epidemic.
And speaking of things that were both life-giving and kind of terrifying, let's talk about the River Thames.
Yeah, it wasn't exactly the scenic river we might think of today.
No, not at all. And our mutual friend, Dickens, introduces us to Gaffer Hexam, a man who makes a living by recovering dead bodies from the river.
That's pretty grim.
It was a necessary job, though, in a city where death was everywhere.
It shows how the Thames was both essential to London and a source of danger.
People relied on it for transport, trade, even making a living.
But it was also where they dumped waste, sewage, and unfortunately, bodies.
Yeah, the opening scene of Our Mutual Friend, where Gaffer pulls a body out of the murky water, it really sets the tone for the whole novel.
It's like we're immediately plunged into this dark side of London.
A world where poverty, crime, and death are all connected.
And Dickens uses the river as a symbol, too.
Yeah, right.
It represents all those hidden things going on beneath the surface of society.
Secrets, lies, things people don't want to talk about.
Like the river itself, they could emerge at any moment.
It's fascinating how Dickens connects those seemingly different things. The river, poverty, even death.
He weaves them all into these compelling stories. It's like he's saying that even in the darkest parts of London, there are stories to be told.
And lessons to be learned.
Yes. And those stories often reveal the complexity of human nature
The struggle between good and evil.
and the constant fight for survival that so many Londoners faced.
The Thames, it's like a microcosm of London itself, both life-giving and full of despair.
It's a powerful symbol that runs through so many of his works. And it reminds us that even in the most challenging circumstances, there's always hope, always a chance for redemption.
That's a really powerful thought, especially when we think about the lives of people in Dickensian London.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how they found hope in such a difficult world.
And how their stories can inspire us to find hope in our own lives, even when things seem bleak.
That's the beauty of Dickens. He shows us that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can endure.
And that even in the most unexpected places, we can find beauty, connection, and maybe even a little bit of magic.
And maybe that's why his stories continue to resonate with us today, even centuries later. They remind us of our shared humanity, our capacity for both good and bad.
And the importance of fighting for a better world, no matter how small our actions may seem.
They're a call to action, an invitation to look beyond ourselves and see the world through the eyes of others.
To recognize the struggles of those around us and to extend a hand of compassion and understanding.
And maybe, just maybe, to find a little bit of that Dickensian magic in our own lives.
The Thames, it was like so much of Dickensian London, this weird mix of hope and despair.
Yeah, for sure. And it's not just physical survival that Dickens explores.
Right?
He goes deep into his characters' emotional and psychological battles. Like in Little Dorrit, there's this really powerful scene on London Bridge with Amy.
Oh yeah, London Bridge, a place that connects different parts of the city. It becomes like a crossroads for Amy.
It does. She meets a young woman there who's about to jump, driven to despair by poverty and a life of, well,
Prostitution, it's so sad.
it is. It shows how few options women had back then, either marriage or, tragically, prostitution.
Right, and the bridge, usually a symbol of connection, it becomes a symbol of desperation.
Exactly. What's so powerful about that scene is Amy's reaction.
Yeah.
Even with all her own hardships, she reaches out to this woman.
It's a brief moment, but it speaks volumes about Amy's character.
Yeah, she shows so much empathy, even in the darkest situations.
And Dickens's concern for women in those circumstances, it wasn't just in his writing.
Right.
He co-founded Urania Cottage, a place to help former prostitutes get back on their feet.
He was really walking the walk, wasn't he?
Urania Cottage was pretty radical for its time. They taught women new skills, helped them escape that cycle of poverty.
It's inspiring to see him taking action, not just writing about problems.
Yeah, it shows his belief in second chances,
Yep.
in the power of redemption.
It's amazing how Dickens could shift between such different settings and themes.
Right. We've gone from prisons and prostitution to this warm, hopeful world of A Christmas Carol.
Yeah, A Christmas Carol gives us a totally different view of London, one full of joy, generosity, and second chances.
It's probably his most famous work, but there's a lot going on beneath the surface.
It's not just a feel-good Christmas story, right?
No, Dickens uses Scrooge to show the huge gap between rich and poor in Victorian London.
And to challenge people's attitudes towards poverty.
Remember those scenes where the ghost of Christmas Present takes Scrooge to see the slums?
Yeah, he doesn't hold back on the suffering those people endured.
Dickens describes their tiny meals, their worn-out clothes, their crumbling homes.
It's like he's forcing the wealthy to confront the consequences of their indifference,
He wants them to see the human faces behind the statistics.
to realize that poverty isn't just an abstract concept, it's people's lives.
He does it so powerfully with such vivid language. Like when he writes, "The spirits stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful on foreign lands, and they were close at home, by struggling men, and they were patient in their greater hope. By poverty, and it was rich. In almshouse, hospital, and jail, in misery's every refuge, where vain man in his little brief authority had not made fast the door and barred the spirit out, he left his blessing and taught Scrooge his precepts."
Those lines really stay with you. They show how strong the human spirit can be, even in the face of so much hardship.
But they also point a finger at those in power who don't do enough to help.
Yeah, and Scrooge's transformation, going from miser to philanthropist, that's the heart of the story.
But it's just one man's act of charity, right?
Right.
It doesn't solve the bigger problems that keep people trapped in poverty.
It's like Dickens is hinting at the need for real systemic change.
That Scrooge's change of heart is just the beginning, a spark that hopefully ignites something bigger.
So even in this Christmas story, Dickens is pushing us to think critically about our own role in making society more just.
He's challenging us to look beyond the surface and confront the uncomfortable truths.
And that's what makes Dickens so brilliant.
He could weave these serious social messages into stories that people loved,
He wasn't just entertaining, he was a social reformer at heart.
using his writing to expose injustice, to make people feel empathy.
And to start conversations that are still relevant today.
It's amazing how he blended entertainment and social purpose.
He knew how powerful storytelling could be, how it could move people.
And he used that power to fight for a better world.
It's inspiring, really.
It is, and it makes you realize that we can all use our own talents, our own voices to make a difference.
Even if it's just in small ways, like being kinder to those around us.
Or speaking up for what we believe in.
Yeah, it's about recognizing our shared humanity and working together to create a more just and compassionate world.
Like Dickens did through his writing.
So let's keep exploring his work, keep those conversations going, and see what other insights we can uncover about ourselves and the world we live in. We've really journeyed through Dickensian London, haven't we? From that grim Marshalsea prison to that scene on London Bridge, Dickens really showed us what life was like back then.
He had a gift, capturing the essence of a place, the good and the bad, the darkness and the light, all mixed up in this big city.
And his characters, they feel so real even after all these years.
Yeah, like they could step right off the page.
We talked about Amy Dorrit and Scrooge, but there are so many more.
Oh, so many. Like Bob Cratchit, struggling to get by, working for a terrible boss, but still finding joy in his family.
Yeah, he represents that strength and dignity of the working class.
Exactly. And then there's Nancy in Oliver Twist, caught in a life of crime, but still capable of love and sacrifice.
Her story breaks your heart, doesn't it?
It does. It shows how easily people can fall through the cracks of society.
But Dickens never makes them into caricatures.
Right. He gives them depth, makes them human, even when he's making a point about social issues.
He makes you think about the bigger picture, about your own place in the world.
And he was so ahead of his time, tackling issues that people didn't want to talk about.
Yeah, poverty, child labor, the struggles of everyday people, the corruption.
And he did it with humor, wit, making it all so readable.
One minute you're laughing, the next you're crying.
That's the magic of Dickens. He makes you feel it all.
And his work is still so relevant today, isn't it?
It is. We're still dealing with so many of the same problems.
Inequality, poverty, people being exploited.
His stories remind us that the fight for a better world never ends.
And that we all have a part to play in that fight.
He challenges us to look beyond ourselves, to see the good in others.
To use our voices and actions to make a difference.
That's his legacy, really, inspiring us to create a world where everyone has a chance.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Dickensian London, what stands out to you?
I think it's that Dickens showed us literature can be more than just words on a page. It can be a force for good.
A way to open our hearts and minds.
A call to action to build a more just and compassionate world.
Well said. So let's take those lessons with us. Be kinder, be more engaged, and keep fighting for what's right.
Like Scrooge, maybe we can all find a bit more generosity in our hearts.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Dickensian London. We hope you enjoyed it.
If you want to explore further, check out the show notes for the sources we used.
And don't forget to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more fascinating journeys into history and the human experience. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.